Welcome back to the Astro Park, everyone. My name is Kwesi Akwa, and last weekend I was able to attend AwesomeCon 2022. It's an annual pop culture convention held in Washington, D.C. This year had some amazing guests, as I was able to meet Anthony Rapp and Wilson Cruz, who played Lieutenant Commander Paul Stamets and Dr. Hugh Culber, respectively, in the latest Star Trek series, Star Trek Discovery. I also caught a glimpse of Kel Mitchell and Melissa Joan Hart, who did a panel talking about their days on Nickelodeon, and it was a really awesome experience. NASA and the National Science Foundation also had a really good presence in the science fair, as they provided some informative panels talking about the upcoming Artemis missions to the moon, black holes, and everything else in between. But my most memorable moment was being able to participate in the convention for the first time as a panelist. My astrophotography panel was a success, as I had about 50 people in the audience, and they asked a lot of questions, which I was happy to answer. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a recording of the panel, so in this video, I'm going to be doing a reconstruction of the panel. Pretty much play-by-play of what I said on stage, but I'll be also adding some elements that I didn't mention. And I'll also provide the original Q&A at the end of the video. It's going to be a long one, so just pull up a chair and get comfortable. So, without further ado, and for your listening pleasure, this is my panel, Astrophotography, Exploring Space with a Camera, presented at AwesomeCon 2022 on Friday evening, June 3rd. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to Astrophotography, Exploring Space with a Camera. My name is Kwesi Akwa, and I'll be your panelist for tonight. So, a quick overview for tonight's panel. I'll be giving a quick introduction about myself. Then I'll talk about the different types of astrophotography that can be done. There's technically 3 different types of astrophotography, but I'll be talking about the 2 that I have personal experience with, and that's in deep space and solar system astrophotography. So, a little bit about myself. I love space. I'm a big space enthusiast. My interest in space first started when I was just a little boy, and I remember my kindergarten teacher at the time showing me a model of the space shuttle and how it worked during indoor recess. I then went home to watch several episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation on television, and that piqued my interest even further. And then I would go to the library to pick up any books that were available on space, and I became basically a giant information sponge on the subject. And I was one of those kids who wanted to be an astronaut when they grew up. Well, I've grown up, and as you can see, I am not an astronaut, but I was still fortunate enough to have been able to turn my passion for space into a career. So after I graduated from college, I began working as an engineer at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in the Earth Science Division, and I've been there for the last 7 to almost 8 years now. At NASA Goddard, we work with 3 different spacecrafts called Terra, Aqua, and Aura, and each of them have their own specific Earth observing mission. And I first started as an operations controller engineer, where I earned all 3 certifications to operate each spacecraft. Then in March of 2020, I moved up the ranks to become the command and data handling engineer for the Terra spacecraft, and I've been at that position ever since. So working at NASA has been a dream come true for me. I've learned a lot of stuff over the last several years, and I've met some amazing men and women on the Earth Science team that I'm proud to call my colleagues as well as my friends. and I look forward to the new things I'll be learning later in the future. Now, you don't have to be an astronaut to explore space. You can do it right here from the ground on Earth, and you can do it from the comfort of your own backyard. And one of the ways I like to do it is through this crazy, frustrating, but fun and rewarding hobby of astrophotography. So, what is astrophotography? Astrophotography is the photography or imaging of astronomical objects, celestial events, or specific areas of the night sky. And a cool fact, the first photo of an astronomical object, which was our moon, was taken all the way back in 1840. And advances in technology in the late 19th century allowed for more detailed stellar photography. And this revolutionized professional astronomical research, which allowed the researchers to record thousands of new stars that weren't visible to the human eye. Today, though, astrophotography is mostly used as a subdiscipline in amateur astronomy, usually seeking pleasing images that we refer to as pretty pictures rather than scientific data. And although there are astrophotographers that do both, a majority of them tend to focus on the former rather than the latter. And amateurs use a wide range of special equipment and techniques for astrophotography. And I'll talk about some of the equipment and techniques that I use later on in the panel. And this photo to the left, courtesy of Mr. Andrew Common, who was a British astrophotographer. He took the very first long exposure photograph of the Orion Nebula all the way back in 1883. And it just goes to show that even given with the technology that they were using at the time, they were still able to produce a pretty outstanding image. So the first type of astrophotography that I do is called deep space astrophotography. You may also hear the term deep sky. It means the exact same thing. And with deep space, we're working with objects that are outside of our solar system. So they can be hundreds, thousands, or even millions of light years away from Earth. And deep space objects fall into one of three categories. They can be galaxies, star clusters, either open or globular, and also nebulae. And these two images here are photos that I've taken that explain all three categories. So this image on the left is a photo of the Milky Way's next door neighbor, and this is Messier 31, or the Andromeda Galaxy, located in the constellation of Andromeda. And the image to the right is a photo of Messier 20, or the Trifid Nebula. And a little bit to the upper right of the Trifid, you'll see a small group of blue stars. That's the Messier 21 open star cluster. And this region is located in the constellation of Sagittarius. So the first type of deep space imaging that we can do is called broadband imaging. And this is one of two different types of imaging. So broadband targets emit light on a broad range of the visible spectrum. And this type of imaging is used mainly on galaxies and star clusters. You can also use it on some nebulae targets as well. If it's available to you, it's recommended to go to a dark site where the skies are as dark as possible. And you want to do this imaging during the phase of the new moon. Or if the moon is already out, you want to wait for it to set a little bit on the horizon. However, if you're stuck in the suburbs or the city, you can still do broadband imaging. It's a little bit more challenging, but it can be done. And you want to use a light pollution filter to accomplish this. And one of the filters that I use is called the L Pro, or Luminance Pro, made by a company called Optolong. And usually when you get a light pollution filter, it comes with a transmission graph, as this example shows on the right. So the red line represents the filter, And everything underneath the red curve or inside of it is what's being passed through the filter, and everything outside the red curve is what's being blocked. So that's the unwanted light pollution gradients. And these two images on the bottom are examples of photos that I've taken using the L-Pro filter. So the image on the left is one of my favorite galaxies. This is Messier 51, or the Whirlpool Galaxy, in the constellation of Canis Venoctici. And the image to the right is a large nebula complex. There's 7 different types of nebulae in this single photo, but it's known for 2 distinct ones. So this is a photo of the Horsehead Nebula, which is the dark nebula in the center that resembles a horse's head. And a little bit to the left, you'll see a nebula that looks like a yellow golden leaf. This is the Flame Nebula. And this nebula complex is in the constellation of Orion. So the second type of deep space imaging we can do is called narrowband imaging. So narrowband targets emit light on specific wavelengths on the visible spectrum. And this type of imaging is used mainly on nebulae targets. And the 3 types of wavelengths that we use in astrophotography are H alpha, or hydrogen alpha, S2, sulfur 2, and O3, which is oxygen 3. And on the spectral range, S2 and H alpha are on the red end, with sulfur 2 being at 672 nanometers, and H alpha being at 656 nanometers. And O3 is on the green to the little bit of the blue side, which is around 500 nanometers. And the most popular combination for these 3 wavelengths is called the Hubble palette, which is the SHO. So that means we put the sulfur data in the red channel, the hydrogen alpha in the green channel, and the oxygen 3 in the blue channel. And this type of imaging is also used by the Hubble Space Telescope, hence its name. And this combo is used mainly with monochrome or black and white cameras. So we have a filter that's assigned for each wavelength that we put in front of the camera. And this photo on the left, courtesy of Mr. Sean Nielsen, he was able to take a Hubble palette image of the Heart Nebula in the constellation of Cassiopeia. Now, if you own a color camera, such as a DSLR or mirrorless camera, or even a dedicated astrophotography camera, you can still do narrowband imaging, but you have to use what's called a multi-band pass filter. And these filters pass multiple wavelengths with a single filter, and duo narrowband filters are the ones that are most commonly used. There's also tri-band and quad-band filters, but those tend to be a little bit more expensive. And the duo narrowband filters usually pass hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3. And the most popular combination for this type of narrowband imaging is called HOO. So once again, the H alpha data goes into the red channel, and the O3 data goes into the green and blue channels. And these 2 photos on the right are examples of images that I've taken in HOO. So the top photo is an image of the North America Nebula on the left and the Pelican Nebula on the right. And this region is in the constellation of Cygnus. And the bottom is an HOO image of the Rosette Nebula in the constellation of Monoceros. So for the equipment that we use in deep space photography, I touched up a little bit on the cameras. So you can use a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, because most likely you'll have that type of camera already in your household. So it's a great camera to use to get started with. But people also use dedicated astrophotography cameras. This is because with DSLRs, they tend to generate a lot of heat, especially during the summertime, and that can cause some noise in your image. So with these dedicated astrophotography cameras, they have built-in cooling systems, which have fans that blow cool air on the back of the sensor, which helps to minimize the noise. And also with telescopes, we tend to use short and long refractor telescopes, which are the ones that are recommended. A short focal length telescope will give you a wide field of view to help you find objects in the night sky a little bit easier. And the longer refractors have a narrow field of view for those smaller galaxies and nebulae. And the refractor is recommended because if you place a DSLR at the end of the refractor, you can think of the telescope as just one big camera lens. So if you already have some photography experience, the refractor telescope is really easy to use and it requires very little to basically no maintenance. And these refractors are special refractors known as triplet apochromatic refractors. So there's actually 3 lens elements in the front, and one of those elements is made of ED glass, or extra low dispersion glass. And with that ED glass installed, all of the wavelengths of light from the red end of the spectrum to the blue end of the spectrum will all come into focus at the same point, which will give you a nice, high contrast, true color image of your subject. So the process that we use for creating deep space photos is through what's known as stacking. So you have to remember that these objects are located in deep, deep space. So the light emitted from them traveled through space for hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years before finally reaching us on Earth. So we have to take a long exposure to collect all of that faint light. However, we can't use just a single exposure, because not only will the image be very faint, it will also be very noisy. So multiple exposures of the subject are required. And then we take all of those exposures and stack them together in post-processing to boost the SNR, which is the signal to noise ratio. So we'll be increasing the signal while decreasing the noise. And the more time you spend capturing exposures, the higher the overall resolution will be. And that's known as the total integration time. So these 2 photos at the bottom are examples of a pair of galaxies that I photographed. So the one on the left was my very first astrophoto of Bode's galaxy on the left and the Cigar galaxy on the right. So Messier 81 and 82 respectively. So my first time imaging this field in 2020, I put in an integration time of 1 hour and 44 minutes. And overall, it turned out to be pretty well for my first try. But when I revisited the region again in 2021, I sunk in 4.5 hours of integration time. And as you can see by comparison, the one on the right is much brighter, and you can see additional details that I wasn't able to capture in 2020. Especially in the Cigar galaxy, I was able to pull out more of the red hydrogen alpha starburst region in the middle. So you can see that with more integration time, you'll be able to pull out more contrast and faint detail. So with deep space photos, be prepared to sink in several hours over multiple nights. So this is a typical setup that you'll see for a deep space astrophotography rig. So everything begins with the mount. So I use what's known as an equatorial mount. So this mount will track the object as it moves across the night sky, and it will also counteract the effects of the Earth's rotation. And for it to properly work, the mount has to be polar aligned, which means that the right ascension axis in the front has to be pointing towards the north celestial pole, since we're in the northern hemisphere. And if you're in the south, you point it towards the south pole. So I have a polar camera to help me with those calculations. And on top I have my imaging telescope and my imaging camera. And on top of the main scope, I have a smaller scope, which is called a guide scope, and a guide camera in the back. And this helps me to do what's known as auto guiding. So the guide scope will then communicate with the mount to make little adjustments in the right ascension and declination axis to make sure that the image is as steady as possible. And I have a finder scope to help me locate objects as well as to help me with my star alignment process. And then the counterweight at the bottom will basically counterbalance all of the weight from my equipment on the top. I have the batteries to power up the mount as well as the fan on the imaging camera. And I also use the hand controller to punch in the object that I want to see, and then the mount will then slew to it, center it, and then track it as it moves across the sky. And then everything is ran through my laptop where I run all of my image acquisition software. So for a typical workflow for deep space, I usually do this in 3 phases. So I have a planning phase, an acquisition phase, and a processing phase. So with the planning phase, I first gather all of the information on the target that I'm getting ready to photograph. So the location in the sky, how much time I have to image it, and things of that nature. Then I plan the frame, so I select the best telescope and camera combination to help me get the proper field of view. So once I finish that, I can then go outside and start the acquisition phase. So I set up all of my equipment, polar align the mount, then I set up all of my acquisition software and cool down the camera to below the ambient temperature. Then I star align the mount so that the mount knows where it's pointing to in the sky, and I focus the telescope. And then once I finish all of that, I can then slew to the target that I'm getting ready to image. I then also set up the guiding software so that it can communicate with the acquisition software. And while it's going through its calibrations, I can then prepare the imaging plan to select how many exposures I want to take. And then when everything is locked in and ready to go, I can then acquire my exposures. I also check for focus periodically, usually about every hour or so, because as the night progresses, the temperature can drop. And when the temperature drops, the metal in the telescope can flex ever so slightly, and that can change your focus a little bit. So you want to check your focus every so often. So after my imaging session, I acquire my calibration frames, and these frames help to enhance the overall image even further. So I shoot 3 different types of frames: the dark frames, flat frames, and bias frames. So the darks and the bias will remove any thermal currents and bias currents respectively. And the flat frames will remove any uneven light illumination as well as dust motes. So after that, I then warm up the camera to above ambient temperature and then tear everything down, pack it up, and head back home. So then I can start the processing phase. So I put together all of the images that I took during my session and then stacked them all together. And this stack is what's known as the linear image. I can then take that linear image and bring it into software to process it even further to get the final image. So I usually start by doing a crop around the edges to remove any stacking artifacts. And then I do a DBE, which is a dynamic background extraction to remove any light pollution gradients. I then do a color balance to make sure that the red, green, and blue channels are evenly aligned. Then I do some additional noise reduction. And then I do a histogram stretch where I bring the details of my subject into the foreground. And from there, the image becomes what's known as non-linear. And then from there, I can do some additional sharpening, add some contrast, and then a little bit of a color saturation boost to bring out some of the color. So for planning, I use a website called Telescopius. You can create a free account there. And basically, you type in the object that you want to see, and it will give you some information, as well as where it's located in the sky and how much imaging time you'll have. And on the right, it shows the telescope simulator, where you can combine your telescope and camera to see what kind of approximate field of view you'll get for your target. And then when I'm out in the field, I use a program called APT, or Astrophotography Tool. So this is where I can see my target in the live view. I also cool the camera to below ambient temperature, do my star alignment and focusing routines, and then I also plan my imaging plan on the right and make sure that the program is connected to my guiding program, which I'll show in the next slide. So then once everything is all set up, I could then run my imaging session to collect my image frames as well as my calibration frames. So the guiding program is called PhD2 guiding. So at the bottom here, you'll see a recycling button. That's the loop button. So if you click that, it will show a series of guide stars in the upper left here to select from. You then select a star and then hit this gray button to start the calibration. And it will move that guide star in all 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. And once the calibration is complete, it will then lock onto that star with the green crosshair, and then it will start guiding. So it will make small calibrations in both axes. So the blue line is right ascension, and the red line is declination. So ideally, you want this line to be as smooth as possible, but if there's some minor bumps, then that's perfectly nominal. You just don't want any major bumps, so that will tell you that something pretty bad has happened and you want to troubleshoot that. So for processing, I use a program called Deep Sky Stacker, or DSS. So I'm going to do a small walkthrough of a galaxy that I photographed last month. So what you're looking at right now is a single 3-minute exposure of that galaxy. Now, there might not be very much going on. You can see maybe just a few bright stars here, there, and there where my cursor is. But right in the center is the galaxy, and we're going to try and bring that out to the foreground. So what we do is put all of the image files in the list below. So I have all of my image frames and all of my calibration frames. Then the program will register those files, and then it will assign a score to each of the image files, and the one with the highest score you'll use as a reference frame for the stacking algorithm. So you want to inspect each individual frame to make sure that the stars are nice and pinpoint, so there's no bloated stars or trailing stars. And you might also see some images that have satellite streaks going through or very large airplane streaks, so you want to remove those as well. Because as the old saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. So you want to make sure that all the bad frames are removed from the stack. So once we've done that, we can then stack everything together. The program will go through the stacking algorithm, and it will create a stacked image of the galaxy. So some of the fainter stars have come out, and you can see in the center a little fuzziness right here. So that's the central core of the galaxy. So this image is in the linear state where we haven't done any processing to it. So I would take this image and bring it into another program called PixInsight. And this is basically Photoshop, but designed from the ground up for astrophotography editing. So what I would do here is I would do my dynamic crop, dynamic background extraction, color balance, and then noise reduction. And in the image here, I'm about to do my histogram transformation, or the stretch. So you can see that I'm pulling the details of the galaxy into the foreground. And now the image is in the non-linear state. And from there, I can do sharpening, add some curves for contrast details, and the color saturation boost. I would also then bring it into Photoshop to do some final touch-ups. And then once I've completed that, I will now have my final process image of the galaxy. So this is Messier 63, or the Sunflower Galaxy. It's located in the constellation of Canis Venoctici at a distance of 29 million light years away from Earth. So the second type of astrophotography that I do is called solar system astrophotography. And these deal with objects within the solar system, so a little bit closer to home. And this includes the sun, the moon, the planets, and some rare events in the form of comets and asteroids. So these two photos that I took were my first photos of Jupiter and Saturn, and I was using an 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope at the time. I was also having some trouble with focusing, so it's a little bit on the blurry side, but I'm still really proud to have been able to capture these. So I was able to pull out some of the cloud band detail and the great red spot on Jupiter. And on Saturn, I was also able to capture some cloud band activity, as well as a little bit of the Cassini division between the rings. So next I'm going to talk about some specifics for solar and lunar imaging. So with solar imaging, this first bullet point probably goes without saying, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway, because solar imaging can be one of the most dangerous forms of astrophotography if you don't understand what it is that you're doing. So please, please never look at the sun through a telescope without the proper solar protection installed, because failure to do so will cause permanent damage to your eyes, permanent damage to your telescope equipment, and you can also start property damage in the form of fires. So please do your proper research before attempting to do this type of photography. Now, with the solar system objects, they tend to be dynamic objects where we can see the changes occurring a little bit more quickly. With the planets, you can see these night by night, but with the sun in particular, you can see these changes pretty apparently as they occur by the minute. And the sun can be imaged in one of three wavelengths. You can do white light, which is a broadband wavelength, and you can also do narrowband in the form of hydrogen alpha and calcium K. So after doing copious amounts of research, I first started doing solar imaging late last March, and I got these first photos of the sun in early April. So I shot these photos using the H alpha wavelength. And in H alpha, we're looking at a region of the sun known as the chromosphere, and we can see several different features here. So with these black dots here, where my cursor is, these are the sunspots, which are the cooler regions of the sun. And they can be as large as the Earth or even bigger. And as a fun fact, 109 Earths can go across the diameter of the sun. So that just shows how big our central star really is. And on the edge, we have the prominences. These are plasma flares that go out into space hundreds of thousands of kilometers before looping back towards the solar surface. And these thick, dark, snake-like structures right here and here, these are called filaments, which are the prominences, but we see them face on from our point of view. And these areas of white here are known as the new active regions. And they can be coronal mass ejections, solar flares, or even new sunspots. And the image on the right, I used an inverted color image. So the sunspots are white and the active regions are black. And the filaments now have like a 3D structure, so it kind of pops out at you, which I think is pretty neat. With lunar imaging, the moon makes for a great beginner target, as it's very bright in the sky and easy to identify. And you don't need a telescope to photograph the moon. A variety of equipment can be used. So if you have a DSLR and a camera lens, you can get a nice full disk image of the moon, and close-up shots can also be taken. So for example, for this image on the left, I took an image of the partial lunar eclipse that happened late last November in 2021. And I used a technique called eyepiece projection. So I basically took my smartphone, put it inside of a smartphone adapter, and I attached an eyepiece to the back and put that whole assembly to the back of my telescope. So you can see that even with a smartphone camera, you can get a very nice, pleasing image of the moon. Now, if you use a dedicated astronomy camera with a telescope like Mr. Andrew Houghton did, you can get a nice close-up image of the moon. So these pebbles right here that make this kind of semicircle, these are actually mountains. This is Montes Apenninus. And you can also get clear views of the craters and also the dark regions, which are called the mare, or the seas. So this region here is called the Sea of Rains. So one of the things we have to worry about during solar system astrophotography is called the astronomical seeing conditions. And this is the degradation of the image of an astronomical object due to the turbulent airflows in Earth's atmosphere. So one of the analogies I like to use when describing this phenomenon is to imagine yourself looking down to the bottom of a swimming pool. So if the water is nice and still, you can see clearly down to the bottom, right? Now, if somebody throws a rock into the water or if somebody dives into the pool, it creates that ripple effect, and you can't see clearly to the bottom anymore. So the same thing is happening in the atmosphere right now because the different layers are swirling around at turbulent speeds, and that causes that twinkling effect. And that's what's referred to as the astronomical seeing conditions. So the process that we use for solar system astrophotography to beat the seeing conditions, we have to take a series of videos. So with these videos, we adjust the gain level and exposure length to achieve the maximum FPS possible, which is the frames per second. So the gain measures the brightness of the image. It's similar to the ISO function on a DSLR camera. So we adjust that, but we want to go a little bit to the dimmer side and adjust the exposure length accordingly to get the maximum FPS. And the exposure times are short, usually within the milliseconds, because with the solar system objects, since they're closer to us, they're also brighter, so we don't have to take a long exposure like we do with deep space photography. So therefore, our integration time will be short as well, usually within seconds to about a minute or so. But we have to account for the planetary rotation. We don't want to record too long of a video because the planets as well as the sun are rotating on their axes. And if the integration time is too long, it will create a smearing effect on the planet or the sun. So you want to make sure that the integration time is a little bit on the short side. So with this video, we take that video and place it in software, and we extract the frames with the best seeing conditions. So that's where the atmosphere is as still as possible. And those best frames are then stacked together to create the final image. So for the equipment used for solar system photography, with the cameras, again, you can use a DSLR or mirrorless camera, but people tend to use the dedicated astrophotography cameras in the form of high-speed webcams. And with telescopes, you can use a short refractor to get a nice full disk image of the sun or the moon, and you can use a long refractor to get some detail on the planets as well as up-close features on the sun and moon. But the main weapon of choice for most photographers is the Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. So the Cassegrain is a catadioptric or compound telescope, which means that it uses both a combination of lenses and mirrors to bring your subject into focus. So these telescopes have a long focal length, but since the light path is folded several times, it comes in a nice, compact, portable form. And that makes it ideal for most solar system astrophotographers. So this is the setup that I use for solar photography. It's a dedicated hydrogen alpha refractor telescope. So my mount is the same for what I use in deep space, but for my telescope I have a few different features. So on top I have what's called a solar finder, because this helps me to locate the sun. You never want to use a standard finder scope to locate the sun because the sun's rays will basically melt the inside. And if you put your eye to that finder scope, then your eye is gone. So you never want to use a finder scope unless it has the proper solar protection installed. So with the solar finder, the light from the sun goes through a small peephole in the front, and it casts a red dot on the back, and that represents the sun. So I can put that red dot in the center, and I know I've locked on to the sun. So the red device in the middle is called a hydrogen alpha etalon. So it basically blocks all of the sunlight with the exception of H alpha, and that light passes through the back to a series of blocking filters, which block out any stray infrared and ultraviolet light. And that light goes to the camera sensor or your eyepiece. So it's a perfectly safe system to either do visual observing or imaging. And then for the moon and planets, I upgraded my 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain to a 9.25-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. So this is the Edge HD 9.25 by Celestron. And I have a finder scope on top to help me find the moon and planets, followed by my imaging camera in the back. And in the middle, I have a device called an ADC. This is an atmospheric dispersion corrector. And the reason why I use this is because where I am in Maryland, the ecliptic, which is the line where the sun, moon, and planets all pass through in the sky, it's pretty low on the horizon, usually about, I think, 40 degrees or so. And at that altitude, I'm looking through a pretty good layer of atmosphere. And the atmosphere can disperse the light from the moon and the planets. So that ADC has a series of prisms to help counteract that dispersion, to help me bring back some of that contrast. And the last element I have is called a Barlow lens. So this artificially increases the overall focal length of the telescope, so it gets me an even closer view of the moon and more detail on the planets. And they come in different sizes. So I was using a 2x Barlow lens in this photo, so everything was magnified by a factor of 2. So a typical workflow that I use for solar system, it's pretty similar to what I do for deep sky, but the only difference is I'm shooting videos as opposed to taking long exposure images. And I don't do auto guiding either. Since the videos are really short, I can just rely on the tracking capabilities of the mount. But the main difference here is the processing. So now I'll be extracting the best frames from my video and then stacking those together to then process the final image. So I apply some color balance, some wavelets, which is the sharpening details, and then also some noise reduction. So for solar system planning, alongside Telescopius, I also use a website called MeteoBlue. So if you click on the Astronomy Seeing tab, it will show you a 3-day forecast of the seeing conditions, which are these 2 columns on a scale of 1 to 5. So the green tells you that we have good seeing, and the red tells you that you have poor seeing. And then the column next to that is the speed of the jet stream, which is also helpful. And then over here, where we have some gray, this will show you the overall cloud conditions hour by hour. So ideally, you want these to be zeros to indicate that you have a clear sky. So for acquisition out in the field, I use a program called Fire Capture. So in the upper left here is the control section where I adjust the gain level and the exposure time to get my maximum FPS. And when I adjust that, it also alters the histogram right here. So ideally, you want this to be around 70 to 80% across all 3 channels, red, green, and blue. And then when you have your planet centered and ready to go, you can then click the red triangle to start recording your videos. And then for processing, I use a program called Auto Stackert. So I open the program on the left, and I click the open button to populate the video on the right. I can then click Analyze, and it will analyze each frame in the video, and then organize it from the best frame in the front to the worst frame in the back. So it'll create this quality graph. And ideally, you want to stack everything that's underneath this green curve. So these blue lines represent 25, 50, 75, and 100%. So in this example, I would stack maybe the best, looks like 25 to maybe 40% or so. So I can select that here in the frame percentage to stack. Then I set the alignment points on the planet to show where the stacking algorithm should stack the photo. Then I click on stack, and it will stack the amount of frames that I want, and that'll be my stacked image. So I can then bring that stacked image into Registacks, and here I would apply some RGB color balance, and these 6 sliders on the left are the wavelets. So these apply sharpening to different layers of the photos, so I can just adjust these accordingly to get the best sharpening details. So here's an example of some video data that I shot. So I'm going to go ahead and play the video. So here you're looking at a video of Jupiter that I shot, and you might see a little bit of a shimmery effect. So that's from the effects of the astronomical seeing conditions. So I shot this video in fire capture, then I brought it into Auto Stackert to select the best frames from the video, stack those together. Then I brought it into Registacks to apply color balance, wavelet sharpening, and noise reduction. And I came up with this final process image of Jupiter. So I took this photo using the Edge HD 9.25, and it's a much improved image from what I did with my 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain. So you can see with an increase in aperture, you get an increase in detail and contrast as well. So you can clearly see the great red spot, as well as some of these white circular storms at the bottom. Great cloud band detail. And you can also see a couple of Jupiter's moons. So the one in the front is Europa, and the one in the back is Ganymede, which is the largest moon in the solar system, about the size of the planet Mercury. Some additional images I've taken. I took another shot at Saturn with the Edge HD 9.25, and I did a great job on that as well. So I got some higher contrast on the cloud bands, as well as the hexagonal storm at the North Pole. And you can clearly see the Cassini division in between the rings as well. I also took a photo of Mars back in 2020. This was with my 8-inch telescope at the time, so the focusing was a little bit rough, but I was still able to pull out some great detail on the Planitia fields of Syrtis Major, as well as the white portions of the north and south polar ice caps. And at the bottom was a really cool photo. This is an image of my very first comet. So this is Comet C 2020 F3, or Comet Neowise. So this made the national news back in July of 2020. So it was a very spectacular sight to see. There's also some cool applications you can do with solar system astrophotography. So one of them is in the form of animations. So with the videos that you process into your images, you can use those images as frames for an animation sequence. And some of the popular animations include solar flares, comets traveling through a star field, and also planetary rotations. So here's an example of a planetary rotation that I created. So this is with 3 hours of data that I collected, and you can see 3 of the moons coming in. So apart from Europa and Ganymede, you can also see Io coming out of the shadows as well, and the Great Red Spot transits across Jupiter's surface as well. So I'm going to start at the beginning again, and let's take a look at Europa. So as Europa travels across Jupiter, you'll see a black dot on Jupiter. So that's Europa's shadow being casted on Jupiter. So that's a shadow transit. And just like how our own moon casts a shadow on the Earth during a solar eclipse, you're looking at an eclipse on another planet. And I think that's just an awesome sight to see. So here's some astrophotography tips that I usually give to most people. So the first one is aperture rules, or aperture is king, because a telescope's main objective is to collect light. And it does that with a large aperture, which is the diameter of the lens or the mirror. So the larger the aperture, the more light you're able to collect, and the higher contrast and the more sharpness your final image will have. However, that ties into my next tip, because a lot of people tend to ask me, Kwesi, what's the best telescope to use for astronomy and astrophotography? Well, the best telescope is the one that's used most often, because you can have the largest, most powerful telescope in the world, but as the telescope gets larger, it gets heavier as well. So unless you're super jacked, or if you have a group of friends to help you carry the scope back and forth from your observing site, it's going to kill your enthusiasm for the hobby pretty quickly. So I always recommend to get an aperture that's large enough, but something that you can also handle, and that will get you the maximum usage. So if that's an 8-inch telescope, that's great. If that's a 3-inch telescope, that's great. So long as you're using a telescope and it's motivating you to go outside and take photos, then that's going to be the best telescope for you. I also recommend to learn the night sky, because astrophotography for the most part is pretty automated, but there are some times where equipment can break down on you at any moment, and you might have to take some manual intervention. So it's always a good idea to know where objects are located in the sky, as well as the constellations, so you can help you locate those objects in the event of a contingency. You also want to double check your equipment before heading out. So make sure all of your batteries are charged. Make sure you have all your cables, because I've run into this incident a couple of times in my early days. I remember setting up out in the field only to figure out that I forgot a cable or two. So you just want to make sure that you have everything set up and ready to go before heading outside. And also, this hobby is an outdoor nature hobby, so you might see some critters running around. And if you see any wild animals, please don't provoke them. So I do this from home mostly, so I see the occasional stray cat, but I've also seen some possums, raccoons, foxes, and even deer. And some astrophotographers, where they live, they've seen wolves and coyotes. So if you see any of these wild animals, just try your best not to provoke them, because your safety should be your top priority. And most of all, just have fun. Astrophotography is an incredible hobby, and it's also a very humbling experience. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, this hobby can get pretty crazy and frustrating at times, because Murphy's Law is in full effect, where anything and everything can possibly go wrong. Like something on your mount breaks, clouds come out of nowhere, and it just makes you want to rip your hair out sometimes. And this hobby is also an investment in terms of energy spent, time, and depending on how deep you want to go down this rabbit hole, it's an investment in money. But I can promise you, if you stick with it and iron out any wrinkles that you encounter along the way, and you finally see that return on your investment, in terms of the feeling that you get when you see that final process image that you created of that galaxy or that planet, in my opinion, it's worth more than gold, and you can create some memories that will last you a lifetime. So to wrap things up, here's a couple of places where you can find me online. So last year I started an astrophotography YouTube channel called Astro Park, where I do all of my astrophotography imaging sessions from the park in the middle of my neighborhood. So I shoot different types of images in the night sky, as well as do some equipment and telescope overviews and reviews. And I also do additional astrophotography tips and tutorials. So you can follow the link on the top there. And if you like what you see, you can do the standard YouTube shenanigans, like, comment, share, and of course, subscribe to the channel, as it helps the community grow and reach more people. And second, for telescopists, they have a photo gallery where people from around the world can share their astrophotography. And I have a profile there as well where I post my pictures. So that's telescopius.com/profile/K Aqua. So my first initial followed by my last name. And that brings us to the end of the panel. And in closing, I just want to say that astrophotography is a great hobby that can be experienced by anyone, and you can do it right from your own backyard. So I hope all of you have the opportunity one day to go outside and explore space with a camera. So thank you for listening. And at this time, I'll be happy to take any of your comments or questions. Oh man, that's a really tough one to answer. Although I do like both deep space and solar system astrophotography, I think I tend to like the deep space a little bit more because there's something about those galaxies and nebulae collecting that distant light that's been really interesting to me. So a majority of your money will mostly go into the mount because the mount is the base for all of your astrophotography equipment. So the mount I used in that photo is about $900 on sale. And you want to get a mount that's pretty sturdy and stable so that it doesn't blow over into the wind. Then my telescope on top was about $1,000. And the camera was about $900 as well. So you might want to be prepared to spend something in the thousands, at least maybe 2,000 to 3,000. But I didn't start with that particular setup at once, so I started really small and then progressed as I went on through the hobby. So depending on your budget, you can spend from a few $100s to up to a few $1,000s. It just depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So to photograph Comet Neowise, I used the techniques that I use for deep space photography. So I took several 30-second exposures of the comet, but since the comet is traveling through the star field, I can't really do auto guiding on a specific star. So the technique that I learned is to actually use the comet's nucleus as the guide star in this case. So I put my guide camera to track the nucleus of the comet and took several different exposures on that. And I collected all the exposures like I did for deep space, put it together in Deep Sky Stacker, and then processed it as if it were a deep space photo. So for deep space photography, you can expect the file sizes for your single exposure images to be in the megabytes range. So it usually depends on the camera size of the sensor. So if it's like a smaller sensor, you can get smaller file sizes. And if it's a large sensor like an APS-C or a full frame sensor, you should expect some larger megabytes. For the solar system, however, you're going to expect some videos in the gigabytes range because they're usually uncompressed video files. So a typical 1 minute recording, from my experience, could be anywhere from 2 to 3 gigabytes. And in the example that I use for my planetary animation, that animation contains 59 frames, so I shot 59 videos. So that was a lot of gigabytes worth of data. So you want to have a large enough hard drive to store all of that information. Unfortunately, I've never photographed a meteor shower before, and this kind of ties into the third type of astrophotography, which is called nightscapes. So with nightscapes, people take their cameras and lenses to take wide field shots of the Milky Way. So the Milky Way is usually in the background, and you have some type of nature structure in the foreground. So it could be some plains, some hills, a mountain range, or a forest. And since you have like a wide field of view, you can also catch some of those meteor trails as well. Unfortunately, at this time, I don't have very much experience in nightscapes, but it is something that I'm interested in learning to do in the future. For the acquisition phase, you don't really need that powerful enough of a computer. So the laptop that I use outside is pretty good in terms of power, but I'm just running the acquisition program and nothing else. So you don't really need too demanding of a computer. However, during your processing phase, when you're crunching multiple nights of data, that's when you would probably need like a computer that has a powerful processor. So I've done usually visual astronomy for the longest time. I started with a pair of binoculars, then I upgraded to using a telescope. And I first learned about astrophotography from the YouTube channels that I discovered. So I first discovered this gentleman, his name was Trevor Jones. He has a channel called Astro Backyard, and he has a lot of tips and strategies on how to get started in astrophotography. And then I fell down the rabbit hole to discover other amazing YouTubers such as Dylan O'Donnell, Helena Cochran, Chuck Ayub, and the list was just basically endless. And they all had some amazing tips and information. So after watching all of their videos, that's when I got the hook on that, and I wanted to try it out for myself. And I've been doing that for the last couple of years now. So, and I've also learned some personal tricks of my own. And that's why I decided to start my own YouTube channel to try and give back to the community about what I've learned personally. No, astrophotography is not related to my job at NASA. It's just a personal hobby that I enjoy doing. No, as of this time, I haven't been out of the suburbs to do any astrophotography. I've basically done it from inside of the city. So with the city light pollution, it's measured on what we call the Bortle scale. So it's measured on a scale from 0 to 9, where 0 is the most pristine dark skies, and 9 is if you're standing right in the middle of Times Square, where the sky is just completely washed out in white. So all the photos that I presented in this panel that I took were done under Bortle 7 skies, where I am in Maryland. So it just goes to show that even with that light pollution, you can still get some good images. But a dark site is basically usually the way to go. I know that the closest dark site to me right now is in Cherry Springs, Pennsylvania. And I've also heard of some other sites out west in Death Valley National Park. There's an area, I believe it's called Joshua Tree National Park. So there's a couple of places that I would like to visit to get that dark sky experience. As of now, I haven't done any public outreach events, so as far as outreach goes, I've only done videos on my YouTube channel, so I would count that as like a virtual outreach event. But doing some public outreach events would be something that I would be interested in doing. So that was my presentation on astrophotography, exploring space with a camera. It was a lot of fun presenting at AwesomeCon, and it was a great experience, and it's something that I might try again in the future. So thank you for watching Astropark, and until next time, take care, and I wish you all clear skies.